Welcome to Season 9 of Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who believe the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode is brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today, I am joined by Dr. Brian Goldman, who is a veteran ER physician at Sinai Health System in Toronto and is the author of 4 Canadian bestsellers, including The Power of Kindness, which is a book I have absolutely loved, Why Empathy is Essential in Everyday Life, and his latest book, The Power of Teamwork, How We Can All Work Better Together. Don't we need to do that? Brian, you've got a copy of the book. Would you mind showing our audience what this latest book looks like? Beautiful, beautiful. Love the cover. Which shows how empathy and teamwork go hand in hand, both inside and outside of the healthcare settings. Oh my gosh, so salient for the times. Using his real-world experience, Brian wants to show people how having empathy can transform healthcare as we know it. Dr. Goldman has lectured at universities and special events and conferences around the world. His inspiring yet bracingly honest TEDx talk about medical errors, which has been viewed nearly 1 million times, has cemented his reputation as one of his generation's keenest observers of the culture of modern medicine. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Happy to be speaking with you, Anita. I hope you're having a good day.
Yeah, it's bright and sunny in Montreal. What's the weather like in Toronto?
It is kind of gloomy. It's that November weather that says winter is coming, as they say on Game of Thrones.
Well, I hope you find a patch of sunlight somewhere along the day. I love your book. And as somebody who's read a lot about empathy over the years, what I love about the book is that each chapter takes us on a different dimension of empathy across robots, across inclusive workplaces with a man who hired people with disabilities and had a thriving business. I mean, I just absolutely, and then neuroscience. You wrote this book with a special intention in mind, which came from a pure place as you had some self-awareness about yourself in the ER room. Do you want to tell the backstory?
Yeah. The backstory to that is that it's about a quarter of a century ago. It's a long time ago that I've been carrying this. I was a youngish emergency physician, kind of wrapped up in my own distress. I don't want to give too much of that away because that was a part of my personal growth. And that TED Talk that I did, which also came after that, was about coming to grips with the, that kind of self-preoccupation and that's rooted in shame. And if we have some time, I'll talk about that. But, I saw this family. I was my young defensive self. Hated being caught out making errors, hated being caught out with social faux pas, and, hated being accused of unkindness. And I saw this woman who was brought to the emergency department by ambulance. She was in the end stages of multiple sclerosis, and her family had been taking care of her at home. They had been taking loving care of her and had come to the conclusion that they could no longer look after her properly at home. And like a lot of other families, were uncertain about what would happen next. Didn't want to preside over her death, didn't want to do things wrong, felt like they needed more, didn't know where to turn. And like a lot of other families, they brought their loved one to the emergency department where I saw them. And, I had learned at that point, I was a seasoned enough emergency physician at the time, probably 12, 13 years into practice, that I knew that you don't, like, they wanted her to be admitted to hospital. There was a husband, there were adult children, there's some of their spouses, pretty large retinue. That's part of it. And they wanted her admitted to hospital. And I was not somebody who was going to stand up and say, I will not give you what you wanted, like some cowboy or cow person emergency physicians do. I made the referral to the internal medicine team. And because she was not acutely ill, they have this thing called triage, where they would, every time somebody who was sicker arrived, somebody who was septic, somebody who had pneumonia, somebody who was short of breath, chest pain, whatever, they would see them first. And she kept going, further and further down this list. And we're talking hours. So I saw her early in a day shift on a weekend, and this went on for hours. And as I said, there was this large retinue, large family at the bedside, and every time I would walk by, they'd pull me into the room and ask me a question like, when's my wife getting a bed? I don't know, because that's what the humble mentors tell you you're supposed to say. Answer with humility, I don't know, when you don't know the answer to a question. Can you estimate when she'll be getting a bed? I don't know. Went by. And the cycle would be repeated every hour or so. And at the time I was very defensive about not being able to answer questions and not having the agency to kind of make that consult happen. And I got more and more defensive and more irritated. And about 4 or 5 hours into this, the spouse of one of the adult children raised a Mr. Spock eyebrow, a Spockian eyebrow, and said to me, did you actually make the referral? In a bit of a sarcastic tone. And I snapped at her. Very uncharacteristic for me. I was quite seasoned at that time to know that you don't yell at patients. If you're getting into an argument with patients, you're losing. By definition, you're losing. You've lost yourself, you've lost your empathy, you've lost all of that. But I snapped at her. And the snapping was not yelling at her. I said, I did what you asked. And I walked away. She was eventually seen by medicine. She was admitted to hospital. And a few months later, she passed away, not unexpectedly. And then I received this beautiful letter from, I wouldn't have been able to pick the guy's name out of a lineup. His name is Ruben Rosenblatt. He's still alive. He's over 90.
Wow.
And beautifully handwritten letter inviting me to meet with the family so I could learn about this woman who was my patient, wife, mother, employee, pillar of the community, somebody who they had taken devoted, they had provided devoted care until nearly the very end. And so that was part of the letter. And the other part of the letter was so that the family could see whether there was any residual kindness buried under all of that brusqueness that I showed. And when a family, we're used to it. When families accuse you of incompetence, malpractice, they may be right, they may be wrong. If you follow medical malpractice, you know that it's all shades of gray, unless you've taken the wrong leg off. And even then, it's not one person's fault. It's a system that allowed that to happen. But so you can make arguments about competence, and I'm still practicing. So I must have something on the ball. But when they accuse you of unkindness, you're busted. Everybody knows kindness. Everybody knows what it is. So it kind of activated my shame response, but it also, I understood something about that letter. That letter did not come across to me as an accusation. It was a lifeline. They were throwing a lifeline to me. That letter said, this guy is still salvageable. Like Scrooge on A Christmas Carol. And I went to that meeting, and my chief offered to go with me, very kind of him. And I instinctively knew that they didn't want to see a Politburo, a committee saying we did the best we could. Well, we have this thing called triage, and it's really difficult. Our employees are under stress. And you're hearing that today. You hear a lot of that today when you hear about emergency departments that are clogged up. Except they really are under stress, and there really is burnout, and it's awful. If I can, pardon my French, but it's a shit show right now there. But I knew that they didn't want it. They wanted me. And so I went alone. And they told their story. And I started to cry, and they started to cry. And the funny thing is that I said something that was a throwaway line. I said, because to get out of that room, I said, I'll never forget what you've told me today. And fast forward more than a quarter of a century, when the book The Power of Kindness was published, and I was at a synagogue doing one of my Power of Kindness talks right before the pandemic began. And I saw this distinguished older guy with two middle-aged people accompanying him, who I assumed to be family. And one of the guys says to me, "Do you remember us?" And it was them.
Oh, wow.
It was them. And it was like that moment when Charlton Heston in Ben-Hur, like, I'm really dating myself, recognizes Jesus Christ. I know this man, because that was the one that gave him the water when he was, gave him that simple act of kindness. Almost lost it. And then I knew who they were. And I said, you have no idea. He said, the son said to me, you said you'd never forget us. And I said, you have no idea what you're about to hear. Because I begin my talks with that story, and they saw themselves up there. And
wow.
That was but I have to tell you, I did not understand what it was like to be them until my own parents reached the years where I was caring for them in the same way that they cared for her. And that was when it was that moment when I was in the room with my late father, who had passed away. He died about 1 o'clock in the morning. He sent us all home at 10:30 at night. And because I think he didn't want us to watch him die. I think he knew, because he was having smoldering chest pain. He had a heart condition at the time. He'd cared for my mother for 15 years with Alzheimer's dementia until he could no longer do it. And when she was transferred to the long-term care, it broke his heart. And I remember being in that room with an internist who had recently been a resident, who I knew from Sinai. And I'm not mentioning names, but he was uncomfortable because I'm presuming he was uncomfortable because I had Goldman's dad as my patient, and I couldn't keep him alive for one day. I'm sure that's what it was. And it was awkward. And I remember saying to him, thank you very much for caring for him, and wanting him to leave so that I could just grieve alone with my sister, my brother-in-law. I just wanted to grieve alone. But it was that moment that I truly, in my gut, in my heart, knew what that other family was going through. So I could not have written the book on the first story. I needed both stories. I needed to know, I needed to connect with what it was like to be them. And I mean, that's what we're talking about, empathy. Yeah. That's what we're talking about. The ability to put yourself in somebody else's position and to flip back and forth. I went on this journey, and I discovered that I'm actually pretty good at empathy. It was always there, but man, it got buried under a lot of crap, which I'm sure we can talk about.
So, there's like 3 at least burning follow-up questions that I want to ask, but the one that feels most alive to me is something that you mentioned and said maybe we'll come back to, and I don't want to lose the opportunity to come back to it with the time we have. You talked a little bit about shame and how some relationship you had, some family dynamics or whatever lived experience you had meant that you did not want to be outed as somebody who makes mistakes or didn't have the answers, and that you could root that in shame. And I think your story will be so helpful, because I think so many of us, if not most of us, are walking around with different degrees of that, which is why the work of Brené Brown is so important. So tell us a little more about that.
Well, I wish I could give you an origin story for this kind of massive toxic shame that I feel. And I don't have it. I can't give you that orange. There isn't did I feel shame when I was a bedwetter? Oh yeah, I did. Was that it? I can tell you that one of the origins of my kind of chronic early morning awakening is that I'm hypersensitive to when I have to having an urge to pee. I will not let myself, I would rather wake up and have a lifetime of insomnia than wet the bed. That's pretty clear to me. I wish I could cure it. Would I, at this point in my life, would I take a few wet beds in return for that? I don't know. Something that's an interesting question. I do know that, I suspect, I think for a lot of us, I can tell you intellectually, some sort of emotional cruelty. I think the whole ACEs study and the whole early childhood trauma is a big deal. And why should I be exempt? I'm pretty sure. I mean, I've wondered, if I might have been abused, not by my parents, but I'm thinking about a stranger who was, a custodial worker who had access to the home. That's who I think it could be. But I don't know. I only know that I've lived with this my entire life, where even today, right now, talking to you, I'm not sure that I'm worthy of the air that I'm breathing. I have to earn it. And I've had a lifetime of therapy and a lifetime of going through this kind of stuff. And my gift is to share it with other people, so that, and I'm into the whole Brene Brown idea of not keeping secrets. That and a very wise person who unfortunately had issues with alcohol, and was in and out of recovery, said to me, "It's in the secrets that lie the sickness." And a very different perspective from the way Brene Brown would have put it. But you understand that when you keep it a secret, you're part of the conspiracy to never talk about it. And for my reason, it was because I would be asked to leave the group. I would be ejected from the group. I was terrified with that family, just to bring it back to that they would say, well, if you can't answer these questions, then we're firing you, and we demand that you bring in somebody who is capable. Or they wouldn't even say it, but a more capable internist would come in, the answer person would come in, and they'd be going, oh, great, here's a person who's answering all the questions. And this guy, of course, didn't. And they'd be ignoring me, because I have no standing. I'm not important anymore. That's the pervasive experience of shame. And when I hear, I've picked up little phrases over the years. One of them is the difference between a human being and a human doing. You got it. Yeah. Where I felt as if I'd had to be an overachiever all of my life to earn the oxygen that I breathe.
It is so fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just saying, no origin story, but it's been there and I understand it. It will be a companion for the rest of my life. But talking about it and risking being vulnerable is by far the better path for me. And I think for everybody who feels it.
Yeah, because not only can you flip the switch, I heard recently, so I've had experiences with fear of judgment, and that are rooted in shame, and that are always rooted in worthiness. And I've recently had an incredible life-altering experience doing equine therapy / coaching, and learning from the horses what my worthiness is. Anyways, it's a story for another day, and I'm happy to tell you about it offline. But one of the things that I learned is when we fear being outed as unworthy, right? Because that's the essence of the fear. Basic fear responses are fight, flight, or freeze. We know that. I learned that there's a fourth one, and that is to fawn. And the fawning is where you can, through your own charm and storytelling, or whatever your skill set is, you can fawn to the people that are freaking you out. And I've discovered that might be one of the ways that I compensate. But the easier way is to actually give yourself permission to be seen vulnerably in all our imperfections, and allow yourself to sort of, just be who you are in your full, full disclosure of imperfections. And by doing so, you actually show up as authentic, and then therefore trustworthy and more likable. And you give other people permission to do the same. And I just feel that there's I wish we could, for each individual, learn that process, but then at an aggregate level, imagine what society would look like if we didn't always feel this need to impress each other and perform and outdo each other. So anyways, I had to ask that question because you talked about it. And I think it's a really, really important thing to consider. How are we behaving, and why are we behaving the way we are behaving? What are our triggers, and what is it all about?
But make no mistake. Well, I don't have to tell you, there is a price, especially in medical culture, for being vulnerable. And there is a stigma attached to having emotional illness. There is a stigma attached to making mistakes, being seen as making mistakes. and we worship superheroes. We
Mm.
turn health professionals into superheroes who never make mistakes because they can't admit making mistakes. We celebrate sleep deprivation.
Mm.
Make no mistake, we celebrate it.
And I
We don't.
believe that there's a high rate of mental health issues among physicians and also suicide on the rise, right? Am I right to say that?
Yeah, you're right about that. You're right about that. So and it's really important. Like, we could go on and on talking about that, but the important point is that the more wounded we are, the less empathic we are.
Mm.
The Maslow scale of burnout. The higher the scale of burnout, the lower your empathy score on the Jefferson physician scale of empathy.
Mm.
So,
Okay.
yeah. And shame, of course, shame blocks empathy. It simply blocks empathy, just like a black hole sucks in light. If you think of empathy as a sun radiating light on others, using my light to penetrate other people's worlds, to shine a light on them so I can see them, and a black hole is the exact opposite. And when you're in the throes of shame, you're like a black hole instead of a sun.
Oh, so powerful as a metaphor. Okay, I know we're going to talk a lot about the system of healthcare, and we're going to get into teamwork and the place for empathy there, but let's backtrack to the questions I have prepared here. The beginning of your book, you talk a lot about the neuroscience of empathy, and it's well established now that we're hardwired for empathy and we have evolved as a species thanks to our empathic proclivity. So why aren't we empathic and kind all the time?
All right, so because we have this dual nature. We have our higher centers. The empathy sits in our higher centers, our frontal lobes, where we're juggling emotions or layering in emotions and memory, prior experiences, and those mirror neurons that you talked about. They all exist there, but in our primitive brains, we have the opposite. We have this amazing, uncanny ability within nanoseconds to decide friend or foe, enemy or friend, in group or out group, the psychologists call it, and we base it on highly trivial, superficial characteristics like tone of voice, skin color, facial expression. How many people have taken an instant and this is in our lives, usually it's just in everyday life when we're not under stress, it's just rubbing people the wrong way. Like I'm so aware when I rub people the wrong way. And that's what it is. That's all it is. I don't know what it is with that person. I just don't like it. Or they rub me the wrong way. And often strangers are like that. Somebody sits near you on a subway and they're creepy, or they smell different, or they're just in your face, or this is a new worker who has not yet become a coworker. And then gradually, as you get to know them, you have conversations, and you begin to imagine that they could be me. I could be them. They could be a member of my tribe. But we have this in our primitive brains, and it existed because there was a time when if you stepped out of your cave, you could get clubbed to death. And so it had survival. It had evolutionary value to be able to pick friend from foe in a few nanoseconds. The problem is when that's your operating principle, and where does so why ordinarily our frontal lobes harness our primitive selves, and we're able to say that's ridiculous. There's something irritating about their voice, but maybe I can get past it. And so our better selves, our developed selves, suppress the primitive instinct to divide the world into friend and foe, except when we're under conditions of massive stress. When we're under stress, that takes our frontal lobes offline, and all we have is our primitive responses. Example, I am driving to an appointment that I myself have allowed myself to get in the car too late. I've delayed. I've eaten up the time, and now I'm stuck in traffic, and the time's going by, and I'm still hovering between hope and despair. Can I make the appointment on time, or is it all over? Is it all over? And suddenly, every other driver around me is my enemy. And every pedestrian that's crossing the street in front of me is my enemy, and the subway is my enemy, and the cyclists at the side are my enemies. That's an everyday example. Usually it just goes away. But today, we have had so much stress since the pandemic. Now it's inflation, it's job losses, it's people losing purchasing power, it's parents who've had it up to here with
climate change.
Climate change. They're just like we're not picking up the pieces. Healthcare is kind of, the word collapse is increasingly used. We just seem to have one stress after another, and we're finding it really hard to say, things are going okay, because there's lots of stuff that is going okay. Part of it is, the flames have been fanned by social media, by populist leaders like Trump, who know how to kind of harness that fear and loathing of the other. And it's like, it's not hard to see in the United States, for instance, how the attitudes towards immigration right now. That's a perfect example where, we have enough here. We can be kind to others. Oh, no, we can't. We've got to take care of our own, so that's kind of the ecosystem that we're dealing with right now that makes it difficult for us to be our kindest selves, even though we're hardwired for it. Yeah,
which is why we must be purposeful in our kindness, purposeful in our empathy, right? Just to switch the gears slightly and go back to you as a physician, how has the processing of your own medical errors helped you become more empathic as a physician?
Well, first of all, the most fundamental thing is shame. Shame blocks empathy, and the opposite is true. If you talk about your errors, then you're able to make a shift from shame to guilt about your errors. And, shame, I am bad. Guilt, I did bad. I'm not a bad person. I did bad. Mm-hmm. And the difference between the two, with guilt, you want to repair it. So you're motivated to do better next time, to learn all about it so that you don't make the same mistake, to teach others about it so they don't make the mistake you made. With shame, you just want to keep it as a secret. And so you don't confront it, you don't admit it, you don't teach it, you don't talk about it, because every one of those runs you the risk of being eliminated, excommunicated from the group, being deemed unworthy of the group. And by the way, aided and abetted by a system, the College of Physicians and Surgeons they're shame meisters. Mm. They cannot resist giving you a, and they have these, we're going to bring you in for a verbal caution and tell you, what a shameful person you are. Look, you have this beautiful career. How could you be like that? And that kind of thing. And I guess, like they might want to do that for a certain category of repeat offenders who keep doing, keep repeating behaviors that are against the code of conduct for physicians, but they insist on generalizing it to everybody. Mm-hmm. So you're not allowed to say you were tired. You're not allowed to say that you were that you were under stress. You're not allowed to say that there's a system. In fact, a lot of individual physicians, and I wouldn't be surprised if people at the college believe that to say that the system failed is a dodge on personal responsibility. So you're circumventing your own personal responsibility for what and in fact, if a physician doesn't get it, that they were a shameful vessel of errors, and they promise to do better next time, then they might be labeled as not getting it, and be labeled as somebody who could potentially be a repeat offender. So part of that, wearing sackcloth and ashes, is part of the whole ritual. And I mean, we need to do a lot more literature, a lot more research. Certainly in the criminal justice system, there's been a lot of literature on the power of shame, or the powerlessness of shame, to change behaviors. Because that's what you want to use. I mean, shame either changes behavior for the good And if it doesn't, then it's counterproductive. So, but I know you want to ask a question, but I want to get back. I want to make sure I've answered the question. By getting rid of the shame part, that kind of total body reaction that made me want to just not go there, by being willing to go there, two things happen. First of all, it makes me want to repair the mistakes I've made. It makes me want to mitigate. The other thing is that it allows me to take in how the family feels, to empathize with the family when I've made a mistake. And that is a very powerful thing when the family, there are things that you can do to mitigate errors when they occur. There are devastating forms of errors, but a lot of them can be dealt with that way. But the other important thing is that a family, a patient who has had an error wants to know that they've been heard. And it's no accident in our healthcare system, because we tend to have a shame response, that people who've experienced a medical error, the harm from a medical error, often experience a second harm. And that second harm is not being heard and having the system kind of circle the wagons.
Right.
And deny and abnegate and say we did the best we could. I host White Coat Black Art on CBC Radio, and we had a show a few weeks ago about a widower, an engineer, who complained to the healthcare system about the healthcare system that his late wife, also an engineer, received. She had stage 1B endometrial cancer, and within a matter of 8 or 9 months, it turned into stage 4. And he and she felt that she slipped through the cracks, and she should have been monitored and had better surveillance than she had. And so he put together this with astonishing detail, his complaint letter, and basically got a letter back from the authorities saying we did the best we could, and the surveillance was within the standard of care, and it was kind of like almost daring him to sue them, to sue the doctors if they felt that way, and that's not the way to connect with somebody following an error. And it's no accident that most people who go through the complaint process, and after all, people are going to go through the complaint process if they've got something really serious to complain about, a cancer that wasn't diagnosed in time, a serious illness that wasn't managed wasn't managed properly. Most of the people who take the time to write that letter are completely dissatisfied at the end of that process. And that's because we don't do well seeing people who are criticizing us. Have you noticed, by the way, just how defensive, I mentioned defensiveness at the beginning, how overly sensitive to criticism doctors are? Do you know how overly sensitive they are? And you can't improve if you're that sensitive to criticism. They have this kind of gut emotional response that they're like, can't you see how heroic I am? Can't you see what a martyr I am? Can't you see how much sleep deprivation, how much time I have away from my family, how many weekends I've had to give up, and relatively for this great sacrifice that I'm making, how poorly paid I am. And it's all a block to say, don't you dare criticize me. Don't ever criticize me. I'm beyond criticism. And it's not good for patients, and it's certainly not good for people who have that attitude. But if you look carefully, you'll see a ton of defensiveness, and that's part of the shame culture that makes, and again, back to empathy, that makes healthcare. That's probably what makes us as unempathic as we appear to be.
Yeah. And I think about the kind of systems and structures that hold that in place. And, doctors, physicians, and especially I would imagine in ER, like it really is like sometimes life and death, and sometimes human error does enter the mix of things.
Today's episode was brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies.
So I don't think everyone can truly relate with the pressures of being in the medical establishment, but I think that there are similar pressures in the corporate environment to a certain extent. And as you were talking, the story about the difference between shame and guilt really struck a chord, a salient chord for me. So what you said is, when you feel guilty, it's I've done something wrong. When you feel shame, I am bad. I am the bad person in the mix. And just yesterday, I had a friend over for dinner and my daughter was home. And I was, giving my daughter some feedback because she was interrupting us for a little bit of attention. She's 6.5. And ultimately, I, had a talk with her and I said, now I've listened to you a couple of times. I'd like you to play by yourself, go what you do need to do so that mommy can have some time with her friend. And she was gone for an hour and a half on the iPad. And I thought, okay, good. She's taking care of herself. And I spent the evening with my friend. And then this morning, my 6.5-year-old said, that was a really disappointing evening because I felt you completely ignored me. And she called me out on that. And my feelings were, she's right. And I'm glad that she expressed that. How could I have done that differently? But that's where it should have left. It should have left like, I made the mistake. I feel guilty that maybe I could have handled that differently. Where I went with it is, what a bad mom I am, that I just outright, so I think this, what you're talking about has universal application. And obviously the stakes are higher in the medical profession because there's so much that's keeping that in place, because the ethos of the doctor and, like you said, the sacrifices that are being made, these long hours away from family, the attachment that we all have in our culture to what it means to be in the medical profession. But we're talking about people that are close to us. And as you said, sometimes just the humanity of, I'm wrong or I don't know, actually matters. Or just like you said, hearing out the family or hearing out the patient is has so much more potency than just, keeping the rigid stance that a physician might take.
Yeah. And that conversation that I had with that family that set me on the course that ultimately led to the book was really flushing it all out and out into the open. And that was not, there was nothing in that experience that was shameful. It was loving. It was real. And it said, we're still going to be talking to each other at the end of this conversation. This is not a goodbye, you're shameful. And boy, it's not. We've continued to be friends, especially since they came back and saw what seeds they had planted. They saw the crop that grew. Yeah. But that's so different, and there's a lesson in that, because if you're going to have that kind of difficult conversation with somebody, you want to throw them a lifeline. You don't want to say you ought to be ashamed of yourself and goodbye. You want to throw, if you care enough about the relationship, you want to throw them a lifeline that basically says, code it whichever way, you use your own words, whatever, body language, nonverbal. We're still going to be in relationship to one another at the end of this.
I almost feel like that's at a meta level, the conversation that people in the United States need to have in this post-Trumpian, hopefully post-midterm election, kind of throw some people some lifelines so that the relationship can be reestablished. Don't you think?
I do. I agree. Unfortunately, the seductive power of selfishness is so strong right now. Populism. Part of populism is like, do your own thing, but it's also permission to be selfish, permission to say, I care more about my family than I care about this other family. But they don't realize that when you do that, we have to make the case that when you are intentionally mean to somebody else, they don't just suffer, you suffer. To say, again and again and again, if you really believe that when I kicked that person in the ass when they were down, that I feel good. There are moments in your life when you feel good about it and deserve to feel good about it. But revenge is a really bad way to live. It's not good. Revenge is not like it. And interestingly, we haven't talked about the differences between men and women. Women, certainly by attachment, by oxytocin related attachment to their kids, and through breastfeeding, through giving birth and breastfeeding, they are more likely to attach to their kids and more likely to be empathic, because the original attachment relationship with your child is so critical to attaching to other kids and being a teacher who attaches to children and attaching to other kids in the neighborhood and attaching to your community, et cetera, et cetera. Men are more likely than women to enjoy revenge, to take pleasure in Schadenfreude, to take pleasure in the misfortunes of others. And it's by the way, it's a bell curve. So it's not men love it and women don't. There's plenty of commonality between the two, but that's, it's one of the reasons why men are probably more likely to be rabid sports fans who are willing to go to war over a soccer match or a football game. But because they like that revenge part of it, they love, and certainly for a long period of time, men were more likely than women to become law enforcement officers. And I think law enforcement officers enjoy getting the bad guy. Mm-hmm. That kind of the feeling like when you've been stopped for speeding or for some traffic violation and feel like you have been placed on you're a frog who's been being pinned down on the dissection table. Let me go through the ritual of let me go through your records and let me driver's license and ownership and the police check and the lecture and they some of them seem to get a lot of pleasure out of it. That makes their day.
Yeah, it sounds like every place where there's power, there can be that abuse of power, right? Or that kind of sensation of what power feels like, and that there might be a driver there. I want to ask you about what you think the pandemic has done to the practice of medicine in and outside healthcare, just sort of like at a general level.
It's complicated. Certainly, working from home has not necessarily been good for empathy. It's not impossible. It's harder. You have to work harder at it. It's harder to maintain eye contact, to see nonverbal communication, to pick up the breadcrumbs. People do want to reveal themselves. And if you pick up the breadcrumbs, the clues, and ask about the clues, then you'll get answers, and you'll get into a deeper and deeper level of relationship. But often we don't. We decide, nah, because as you said, empathy is a choice. It's a choice. It's a conscious choice. You're not compelled to be empathic from moment to moment, and nor should you be. You got to take care of yourself as well. You do have to take care of yourself. So the pandemic has kind of put up some barriers. At the same time, interestingly, I think the pandemic has been an accelerant for teamwork, empathic teamwork in healthcare. I'll never forget the time that, early in the pandemic, when there was no vaccine and no cure, and all we knew about COVID was what we knew about SARS, which Toronto was one of the hubs for SARS, one of the ground zeros, along with Hong Kong. And all we knew was that it was a disease that primarily affected healthcare workers and could kill them. And I'll never forget, I did a night shift in March or early April of 2020, just after the pandemic was announced. One of my colleagues, Dr. Paul Koblitz, was working the 9 p.m. shift. So he was going to be there to halfway through the night, and I was there starting at 11. He pulls me aside and he offers to do all of my intubations, to put all of my patients on a ventilator, because he's younger, half my age. And so that if he got COVID, he'd survive it. But as far as we knew, if I get COVID, I'm going to die of it. And I don't think that would have happened without this pandemic being declared. It was a selfless act. It made me cry. It was that powerful. I can also tell you that I have seen us, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, through what we call a protected code blue. Code blue is a cardiac arrest procedure. Protected means we don PPE, very elaborate PPE. And from those early days when we ran those protected code blues, we saw people, when they called them, people would come running from all over the hospital to come to the emergency department to assist. So we had these massive teams. We didn't need them all, but they were there. And they acted not only as, like, we would have a small group of people in the room resuscitating the patient wearing full PPE. We'd have people outside the room assisting, helping to facilitate communication, observing us, spotters, to make sure that we donned this elaborate PPE in the right order so that we didn't contaminate, and doffed in the right order so we didn't contaminate ourselves and others. And you had a greater sense of esprit de corps. I would also say that with the novel coronavirus, as they called it, it's now a cliche, there was more of a sense that patients and healthcare workers were in the same boat. Of course, that became a cliche, and then some people, became very resentful of that. People in disadvantaged quarters in society said, we're not in the same boat. We may be in the same ocean, but we're in different boats. That's fine. But there was more of a sense of a shared destiny and a shared challenge that I think made it easier for us to empathize with one another at the time, and increase kindness. Now, of course, we know what happened after that. People started to complain about missing work. Populist voices started saying, vaccine mandates are the reason for this. Bad science, misinformation, and distrust of elites. They're called elites now. People with an academic background, people who know the scientific method. It's utterly fascinating that there are people who talk about COVID vaccines as if they're killers, and need to keep reinforcing the idea that this is part of a plot that's designed to enslave you, to monitor your thoughts, your electronic communications. I mean, in more and more absurd examples, who wouldn't think twice about getting a polio vaccine. Oh, that's or if the doctors, if they had chest pain and came to the emergency department and the doctor said you're having a STEMI, an ST elevation myocardial infarction, and we need to take you to the cath lab to put a stent in, they wouldn't think twice. Good, that's good. They wouldn't be saying, I'm going to do my own research first, and then I'll decide if I'm going to have this, because I really don't trust you.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I want to fit in a final penultimate question before I get to the last one of the conversation. And you've been so generous with your time, and I see that we have 4 minutes till the hour. You've written a book about teamwork and the connection between empathy and teamwork, and it's within the scope and as a result of sort of having lived through COVID, which is kind of an extreme circumstance that played out. So what do you think you would like to share if you weren't in a crisis situation, that you think people who are just looking to improve their quality of their teamwork, what your big takeaway would be?
Big takeaway. Well, first of all, I think most people, I would start by saying that most people think that because we talk team, that we spew cliches about teamwork makes the dream work and all that kind of stuff, that we understand what it means. So first of all, what it means to be on a team is that, as opposed to a group of individuals. And I asked that early on, are you on a team or a group of individuals? A group of individuals, people jockeying for position, have no idea what team goals are because they've never been articulated. Think about the surgeon, the anesthesiologist, and the scrub nurses in the OR. You think they're a team, but do the surgeons say getting the count of instruments right, surgical instruments that go into the belly and out of the belly right is their goal? No, they might say that's the nurse's responsibility. No, it should be my responsibility, and it's it's our responsibility. And you can extend the same logic to a call center, an office, an advertising agency, a school. It doesn't matter. But so a team, and I'll just articulate, some of the aspects of a team. They all know what the team's goals are because they've had a hand in developing them. everybody feels safe to say what they see. So if they see that something's going off the rails, a new plan, a new project that we're working on right now, they see some issues with it, they feel safe to see it, to say their concerns, because they know their concerns will be heard. It is a team has a leader who knows everybody's superpower, and in fact, everybody else knows everybody's superpower on the team because they've been maneuvered around to take advantage of their superpowers and not keep putting them in a position where they're just where they keep repeating failures. When they accomplish something, everybody on the team feels a sense that we did it, a sense of shared ecstasy. When somebody sees something that needs to be changed, the leader doesn't rub out what they say. They don't pass it off with a joke or a cutting comment and everybody laughs and then we move on to the next subject. They air it, because a smart leader not only knows everybody's superpower, empowers them to do their jobs, and doesn't throw them under the bus when mistakes happen or when bad outcomes occur, and can live with uncertainty, a bit of uncertainty. A bad leader who doesn't get teamwork keeps truncating that period of uncertainty when good ideas become great ideas and team goals by putting a time limit on the discussion, get to the point. We do that a lot in healthcare. Can you cut to the chase, please? And we use research and scientific evidence to kind of cut out good ideas and just kind of bury them before they have a chance to get started. So those are some of the aspects of good teamwork. And a lot of us don't know about it, which is why I wrote the book. I didn't know about it till I wrote the book.
Can you hold up your book again? Yeah, I was just going to say, thank you for doing that little summary. Dr. Goldman, what a delicious conversation this has been. You've been incredibly generous with your time. And now I have my final question that I love asking my guests because I never know what to expect. And I imagine you'll have something special to share. And that is, if you can think of a moment when you were on the receiving end of purposeful empathy that you knew was coming on purpose, and what that meant for you.
That I haven't already told you about?
I guess this is the story about that family.
I think the story of that family was purposeful empathy, but it took me a generation to realize that was the case. It's one of those, like, can you think of a good restaurant, that I'll think of a good one after the fact. And I promise to tell you, certainly when Dr. Paul Koblitz offered to do my intubations for me, he was not just trying to save me. He was putting himself on the line at the same time, because we had no vaccine and we had no cure for COVID. And that act of kindness towards me has stuck with me because it was beautiful. It was an affirmation that there is still good in medicine. And I think that there have also been times when people, you know what? A long time ago, a cardiologist, I did a TED talk, which you made reference to. And the first mistake I talked about was about that patient who I saw in the emergency department as a resident and discharged her without asking for my attending cardiologist if that was a good thing to do. And she went home and came back a few hours later, moribund, and she died a few days later. The cardiologist was a very kind man who I really, really wanted to go to the bedside and apologize to the family. And he kind of put up his hand and said to me, "No, I'll take care of it." And he did. There were no repercussions. And I have to say that this is not a shameful thing. I don't feel shame as I described this, but when I told him what I did, he had a look on his face of disappointment in me. But he bore it. And he shielded me. He felt like he needed to shield me. And I think it was because he understood that a seasoned physician can admit to errors and is more likely to be able to handle it in a mature way. Perhaps he knew that an error early in a resident's career could be devastating to them. He was trying to shield me from that, and that was a tremendous act of kindness. And
Powerful story.
my only regret is that I knew that, and he passed away in the last few years, and I really should have sat down with him and thanked him for that, but also talked to him about it. But I'm talking about it now, so I'm paying.
Brian, it's been such a pleasure to meet you, especially, when I read a book and I get to know somebody through the lens of their words, and now I hear your spoken word. It's been a real delight and an honor to spend this last hour with you. And I think my takeaway from our conversation today is just that little gentle reminder that people who are working in the medical field, especially doctors, that they're human too, and that, we, under the circumstances in which we meet them, could also extend a little bit more kindness their way too, knowing that they're doing the best they can. So, well, thank you for being here. Thank you everyone who's been watching and listening. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
What if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free of your thinking clutter, make that important decision, and liberate you from whatever is holding you back? At Grand Huron International, you get to choose the coach of your choice anytime from anywhere. Visit grandhuroninternational.ca and harness the power of on-demand coaching today.